In this video, we will be starting phase 2, which is going to be the thoracic cavity. And in this video, we will be discussing the thoracic cage. So our learning objectives for this video are to list the structures that form the thoracic cage and to describe the boundaries of the superior and inferior thoracic apertures and list the structures they transmit. So, are you ready to talk about this? Well, let's go. I have the thoracic cage pulled up here in VH Dissector because I think that you get a better view when you see it in this 3D aspect. So the thoracic cage can otherwise be called an osteocartilaginous frame around principal organs of respiration and circulation. And this is what we're going to be talking about in this phase 2, are those organs and then this thoracic cage. So you can look at yourself in a mirror to see that the thoracic cage is going to be narrow up above and more broad below. And you can see that there as I drew it in too. Now, if we rotate this to where you can see the anterior aspect, you can see that it is flattened in an anterior to posterior direction. So this is pretty flat right there. And then also the thoracic cage, the anterior wall is going to be shorter than the posterior wall. And let me highlight the anterior wall. What you see in orange is the anterior wall. And if I rotate to the back and I put the thoracic vertebrae and ribs, I'll just do the bottom ribs here. You can see that the purple is much lower than the orange in front. So it's going to be longer in the posterior aspect of the thoracic wall. Now, if you want to talk about the composition of the walls, since I'm looking at posterior, we'll talk about the composition of the posterior wall first. And it's going to be these thoracic vertebrae and also the posterior aspect of the ribs. When I highlight in VH Dissector, it's going to highlight the entire rib, but you can kind of think of the posterior aspect stopping about there where the ribs start to curve around. So it's just that posterior aspect of the ribs. Now, let's rotate back anteriorly, and this orange is what makes up the anterior aspect of the wall. So that's going to be the sternum and the costal cartilages. Now, laterally, the walls are just going to be made up of ribs. And then also the ribs are going to have these intercostal spaces in between each rib. So right in here, this would be an intercostal space. And in those spaces, you're going to find muscles, or if there's not a muscle present there, you'll see membrane. You also see nerves that will transmit through there, vessels, and then also lymph nodes. Now, I want to talk about two different apertures that we see in the thoracic cage, and that's going to be the superior thoracic aperture and the inferior thoracic aperture. So let me get the highlighting off of this. Oops, that's too much. There. All right, so the superior thoracic aperture, you might hear this referred to sometimes as a thoracic inlet. It's typically called the thoracic inlet by anatomists, or it also could be called the thoracic outlet. And you usually see that technology or that term when it's spoken about by clinicians. So when you're reading any kind of research, you could see the superior thoracic aperture called the thoracic inlet or the thoracic outlets. So the thoracic inlet is going to be made up posteriorly by the body of T1. So that highlighted all of T1, but it's just going to be the body of T1 for the superior thoracic aperture. Anteriorly by the superior border of the manubrium of the sternum, So again, that's highlighting the entire sternum, but we're just looking at the superior border of it for the thoracic aperture. And then laterally by the first rib and the first costal cartilage. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and not highlight the costal cartilage, because it will highlight the entire costal cartilage, but it is part of this thoracic aperture as well. And this is going to be an important space for structures to transmit. So you'll see the esophagus go through here, the trachea, and then also numerous vessels and nerves that you'll learn about in this class that are going to go between the thorax on one side, so inferiorly to the aperture, and either the neck or the upper limb on the other side, so superiorly to the aperture. And I can even put some of those structures in. So if I put in the arteries of the thorax, the nerves of the thorax, the veins, and the viscera, you will see then that many structures go through that thoracic outlet. So you got the trachea, and then just multiple nerves and vessels. Like I said, you will learn more about that later on. Let me highlight the esophagus so you can see those right there going through there. You see how the trachea is anterior to the esophagus. That's going to be something important that we'll see later on. But it is just a huge travel way for all these structures that are going from the thorax to either the neck or the upper limb. So that is the superior thoracic aperture, and like I said, also called the thoracic inlet. You'll see that in literature sometimes, especially if it's written by anatomists, or the thoracic outlet, which you'll see a lot of times, especially if it's talked about by clinicians. All right, so let's talk about the inferior thoracic aperture. Oh, I want to say, before I move on from the thoracic aperture, let me say one more thing about it. Let me rotate this, and I'll highlight the superior thoracic aperture. If you look at how it is sloping, its plane will slope anteriorly and inferiorly. So it slopes in this direction. Now, the posterior thoracic outlet, or not posterior, I'm sorry, inferior thoracic outlet, you are going to find below. So it's going to be inferior. And you can, as you can see, it is wider than the superior thoracic outlet, because this is how wide the superior thoracic outlet is. This is how wide the inferior thoracic outlet is. Or really, you'll talk about it a little higher up too. So the borders of the inferior thoracic outlet are going to be the body of T12, the inferior border of the 12th rib. So if I was going to, I'm going to highlight the 12th rib, but we would mainly be talking about the inferior border of the 12th rib. And the tip of the 11th rib. So if I highlight the 11th rib, you can see it a little bit better if I rotate this up. It'll be just the tip of the 11th rib. And then the inferior borders of the 7th through 10th costal cartilages. So this is, again, going to highlight all of the costal cartilages. There we go. And there's going to be this thing called the costal margin, which isn't well defined in here, but that's going to be, the costal margin is going to be the costal cartilages, or the inferior borders of the costal cartilages of the 7th through 10th ribs. So right here, this is known as the costal margin. And like I said, that's the inferior borders of the 7th through the 10th rib. And then also the xyphosternal joint. So the xyphosternal joint, we highlight the xiphoid process right there. The xyphosternal joint is going to be right up in here. And that's the borders of the inferior thoracic aperture. And it does something opposite of the anterior thoracic outlet. So if we look at or not the anterior, I don't know why I keep doing that. The superior thoracic outlet, when we looked at it, it sloped, anteriorly and inferiorly. The inferior thoracic outlet will slope posteriorly and inferiorly. So you can kind of see it going that way. So posteriorly and inferiorly for the inferior thoracic aperture or outlet. So you can use those words interchangeably. Now, it is going to be closed by the diaphragm at the floor. So this is the diaphragm forms the floor of the thoracic cavity. So if I don't know if that'll put it in. Nope. Let's see. Nope. I was going to put in the diaphragm for you. But it's not going to be as easy to do. But the thoracic cavity will be closed by the diaphragm. And structures that run between the thorax and the abdomen will pierce the diaphragm or pass posterior to it. And you'll learn about these structures as we're going through gross 1 and gross 2, because we do speak about the abdomen in gross 2 and the thorax in gross 1, and this diaphragm is that dividing point. Now, you should be able to list the structures that form the thoracic cage and describe the boundaries of the superior and inferior thoracic apertures and list the structures they transmit. All right. So I gave you specific structure names for the superior thoracic aperture. And remember that it's also known as either the thoracic inlet or the thoracic outlet. You don't need to know the specific names of all the vessels and nerves yet. We'll learn them later. And then just remember that the diaphragm is the floor of the thoracic cavity, and that structures either pierce the diaphragm or travel behind it to travel between the abdomen and thoracic cavity. We haven't actually talked about the structures yet that transmit through there. So I encourage you to pause or don't go on to the next video until you rotate around that thoracic cage and take a look and get familiar with the boundaries in VH dissector.